Hi there. Welcome back to our third session in this Lenten journey through 1 John. Last week we talked about love, specifically how love becomes visible through action. This week John shifts the focus to something deeper. He talks about identity. Listen to these words from chapter 3, verse 1. See what great love the Father has given us, that we should be called children of God. And that is what we are. Before John talks about behavior, he talks about belonging. And this order matters because spiritual growth works very differently when it grows from belonging instead of toward belonging. Your group is going to explore 3 questions around this idea. And the first question, what changes when we grow from belonging instead of toward belonging? When belonging comes first, something shifts. The pressure drops. And instead of trying to prove that we deserve God's love, we begin to live out of the love that we've already received. Growth stops feeling like a test that you might fail, and it becomes an invitation. It creates an honesty. When you know you're already loved, you don't have to hide. You could admit where you're struggling. You could admit where you're stuck, and you could admit when you need grace. Belonging creates safety for growth. The second question, where do Christians sometimes drift into a performance? And this happens much more easily than we realize. Sometimes it happens in a visible service. We can start doing things like serving or volunteering, or maybe even taking a leadership role. But really, we're quietly trying to prove something about ourselves. Sometimes it happens through a comparison. Instead of spiritual growth, we start measuring ourselves against other people. Sometimes our identity quietly shifts from child of God to productive Christian. John reminds us that identity comes first. We must belong before we perform. The third question, how does assurance make growth safer? When you know you're loved, correction feels different. Instead of feeling like rejection, it becomes part of our growth. Assurance allows failure. You can stumble without panic because your security with God isn't fragile. That makes obedience less fearful. You can risk stepping forward in faith because your belonging is not at stake. Security makes transformation possible. And this is where justifying grace becomes very important. Justifying grace means God welcomes us before we improve. We don't become children of God because we can succeed spiritually. We're welcomed by grace, and then growth begins. Belonging comes first, transformation follows. At Hillspring, we talk about this kind of growth through one of our values: develop meaningful relationships. Growth is rarely instant. It's more of a process. And that word develop assumes it's going to take time. And it assumes it's going to need patience. And it assumes that when we grow best, when we grow together. God forms us through shared life. And this week we're going to practice something very simple. Every morning this week, start your day with a short prayer of identity, just saying, I'm a child of God. I belong before I perform. And let that truth shape how you approach the day, because when belonging comes first, growth becomes possible. As your group begins taking some time together, explore this question. What does it actually mean to live from belonging instead of striving for it? And be honest with one another. And let grace do its steady work.